Okay. Journey to the Center of the Earth, Chapter 13, The Shadow of Scartaris. Our supper was eaten with ease and rapidity, after which everybody did the best he could for himself within the hollow of the crater. The bed was hard, the shelter unsatisfactory, the situation painful, lying in open air 5,000 feet above level of sea. Nevertheless, it has seldom happened to me to sleep so well as I did on that particular night. I did not even dream. So much for the effects of what my uncle called wholesome fatigue. The next day, when we awoke under the rays of a bright and glorious sun, we were nearly frozen by the keen air. I left my granite couch and made one of the party to enjoy a few of the magnificent spectacle which developed itself, panorama-like, at our feet. I stood upon the lofty summit of Mount Sneffels' southern peak. Thence I was able to obtain a view of the greater part of the island. The optical delusion, common to all lofty heights, raised the shores of the island, while the center portions appeared depressed. It was by no means too great a flight of fancy to believe that a giant picture was stretched out before me. I could see the deep valleys that crossed each other in every direction. I could see precipices looking like sides of wells, lakes that seemed to be changed into ponds, ponds that looked like puddles, and rivers that were transformed into petty brooks. To my right were glaciers upon glaciers and multiplied peaks topped with light clouds of smoke. Excuse me. The undulation of these infinite numbers of mountains, whose snowy summits made them look as if covered by foam, recalled to my remembrance the surface of a storm-beaten ocean. If I looked towards the west, the ocean lay before me in all its majestic grandeur, a continuation, as it were, of these fleecy hilltops. Where the earth ended and the sea began, it was impossible for the eye to distinguish. I soon felt that strange and mysterious sensation which is awakened in the mind when looking down from lofty hilltops, and now I was able to do so without any feelings of nervousness, having fortunately hardened myself to that kind of sublime contemplation. I wholly forgot who I was and where I was. I became intoxicated with a sense of lofty sublimity, without thought of the abysses into which my daring was soon about to plunge me. I was presently, however, brought back to the realities of life by the arrival of Professor Hans, who joined me upon the lofty summit of the peak. My uncle, turning in a westerly direction, pointed out to me a light cloud of vapor, a kind of haze, with a faint outline of land rising from the waters. "Greenland," he said. "Greenland?" I cried in reply. "Yes," continued my uncle, who always, when explaining anything, spoke as if he were in the professor's chair. "We are not more than 30 leagues distant from that wonderful land. When the great annual breakup of the ice takes place, white bears come over to Iceland, floating by the floating masses of ice from the north. This, however, is a matter of little consequence. We are now on the summit of the transcendent Sneffels, and here are its two peaks, north and south. Hans will tell you the name by which the people of Iceland call that on which we stand." My uncle turned to the imperturbable guide, who nodded and spoke his usual one word: "Scartaris." My uncle looked at me with a proud and triumphant glance. "A crater!" he said. "You hear?" I did hear, but I was totally unable to make a reply. The crater of Mount Sneffels represented an inverted cone, a gaping orifice apparently half a mile across, the depth indefinite feet. Conceive what this hole must have been like when full of flame and thunder and light. The bottom of the funnel-shaped hollow was about 500 feet in circumference, by which it was seen that the slope from the summit to the bottom was very gradual, and we were therefore clearly able to get there without much fatigue or difficulty. Involuntarily, I compared this crater to an enormous loaded cannon, and the comparison completely terrified me. to descend into the interior of a cannon, I thought to myself, when perhaps it is loaded and will go off at the least shock, is the act of a madman. But there was no longer any opportunity for me to hesitate. Hans, with a perfectly calm and indifferent air, took his unusual pose at the head of the adventurous little band. I followed without uttering a syllable. I felt like the lamb led to the slaughter. In order to render the descent less difficult, Hans took his way down the interior of the cone in a rather zigzag fashion, making, as sailors say, long tracks to the eastward, followed by equally long ones to the west. It was necessary to walk through the midst of eruptive rocks, some of which, shaken in their balance, went rolling down with thundering clamor to the bottom of the abyss. Those continual falls awoke echoes of singular power and effect. Many portions of the cone consisted of inferior glaciers. Hans, whenever we met with one of these obstacles, advanced with a great show of precaution, sounding the soil with his long iron pole in order to discover fissures and layers of deep, soft snow in many doubtful or dangerous places. It became necessary for us to be tied together by a long rope in order that should any one of us be unfortunate enough to slip, he would be supported by his companions. This connecting link was doubtless a prudent precaution, but not by any means unattended with danger. Nevertheless, and despite all the manifold difficulties of the descent, along slopes with which our guide was wholly unacquainted, we made considerable progress without accident. One of our great parcels of rope slipped from one of the Iceland porters and rushed by a short cut to the bottom of the abyss. By midday, we were at the end of our journey. I looked upwards and saw only the upper orifice of the cone, which served as a circular frame to the very small portion of the sky, a portion which seemed to me singularly beautiful. Should I ever again gaze on that lovely sunlit sky? The only exception to this extraordinary landscape was the peak of Scartaris, which seemed lost in the great void of the heavens. The bottom of the crater was composed of 3 separate shafts, through which, during periods of eruption, when Sneffels was in action, the great central furnace sent forth its burning lava and poisonous vapors. Each of these chimneys or shafts gaped open-mouthed in our path. I kept as far away from them as possible, not even venturing to take the faintest peep downwards. As for the professor, after a rapid examination of their disposition and characteristics, he became breathless and panting. He ran from one to the other like a delighted schoolboy, gesticulating wildly and uttering incomprehensible and disjointed phrases in all sorts of languages. Hans, the guide, and his humbler companion seated themselves on some piles of lava and looked silently on. They clearly took my uncle for a lunatic and waited the result. Suddenly, the professor uttered a wild, unearthly cry. At first, I imagined he had lost his footing and was falling headlong into one of the yawning gulfs. Nothing of the kind. I saw him, his arms spread out to their widest extent, his legs stretched apart, standing upright before an enormous pedestal, high enough and black enough to bear a gigantic statue of Pluto. His attitude and mien were that of a man utterly stupefied, but his stupefaction was speedily changed to the wildest joy. "Harry! Harry, come here!" he cried. "Make haste! Wonderful! Wonderful!" Unable to understand what he meant, I turned to obey his commands. Neither Hans nor the Icelanders moved a step. "Look!" said the professor in something of a manner of the French general pointing out the pyramids to his army. And fully partaking his stupefaction, if not his joy, I read on the eastern side of a huge block of stone the same characters, half eaten away by the corrosive action of time, the name, to me 1,000 times accursed. "Arne Saknussemm!" cried my uncle. "Now, unbeliever, do you begin to have faith?" It was totally impossible for me to answer a single word. I went back to my pile of lava in a state of silent awe. The evidence was unanswerable, overwhelming. In a few moments, however, my thoughts were far away, back in my German home with Gretchen and the old cook. What would I have given for one of my cousin's smiles, for one of the ancient domestic's omelets, and for my own feather bed? How long I remained in this state, I know not. All I can say is that when at last I raised my head from between my hands, there remained at the bottom of the crater only myself, my uncle, and Hans. The Icelandic porters had been dismissed and were now descending the exterior slopes of Mount Sneffels, on their way to Stapi. How heartily did I wish myself with them. Hans slept tranquilly at the foot of a rock in a kind of rill of lava, where he had made himself a rough and ready bed. My uncle was walking about from bottom crater like a wild beast in a cage. I had no desire, neither had I the strength to move from my recumbent position. Taking example by the guide, I gave way to a kind of painful solemnity, during which I seemed both to hear and feel continued heavings and shudderings in the mountain. In this way we passed our first night in the interior of a crater. Next morning, a gray, cloudy, heavy sky hung like funeral pall over the summit of a volcanic cone. I did not notice it so much from the obscurity that reigned around us as from the rage with which my uncle was devoured. I fully understood the reason, and again a glimpse of hope made my heart leap with joy. I will briefly explain the cause. Of the three things which yawned beneath our steps, only one could have been followed by the adventurous Saknussemm. According to the words of the learned Icelander, it was only to be known by that one particular mentioned in the cryptograph, that the shadow of Scartaris fell upon it, just touching its mouth in the last days of the month of June. We were, in fact, to consider the pointed peak as the stylus of an immense sundial, the shadow of which pointed on one given day, like the inexorable finger of fate, to the yawning chasm which led into the interior of the earth. Now, as often happens in these regions, should the sun fail to burst the clouds, no shadow, consequently no chance of discovering the right aperture. We had already reached the 25th June. If the kindly heavens would only remain densely clouded for 6 more days, we should have to put off our voyage of discovery for another year, which certainly there would be one person fewer in the party. I already had sufficient of the mad and monstrous enterprise. It would be utterly impossible to depict the impotent rage of Professor Hardwigg. The day passed away, and not the faintest outline of a shadow could be seen at the bottom of the crater. Hans the guide never moved from his place. He must have been curious to know what we were about, if indeed he could believe we were about anything. As for my uncle, he never addressed a word to me. He was nursing his wrath to keep it warm, his eyes fixed on the black and foggy atmosphere, his complexion hideous with suppressed passion. Never had his eyes appeared so fierce, his nose so aquiline, his mouth so hard and firm. On the 26th, no change for the better. A mixture of rain and snow fell during the whole day. Hans very quietly built himself a hut of lava, into which he retired like a Diogenes, into his tub. I took a malicious delight in watching the 1,000 little cascades that flowed down the side of the cone, carrying with them at times a stream of stones into the vast deep below. My uncle was almost frantic, to be sure. It was enough to make even a patient man angry. He had reached to a certain extent the goal of his desires, and yet was likely to be wrecked in port. But if the heavens and elements are capable of causing us much pain and sorrow, there are two sides to a medal. And there was reserved for Professor Hardwigg a brilliant and sudden surprise, which was to compensate him for all his sufferings. Next day the sky was still overcast, but on Sunday, the 28th, the last day but 2 of the month. With a sudden change of wind and a new moon, there came a change of weather. The sun poured its beaming rays to the very bottom of the crater. Each hillock, every rock, every stone, every asperity of the soil had its share of the luminous engulfments, and its shadow fell heavily on the soil. Among others, to his insane delight, the shadow of Scartaris was marked and clear and moved slowly with the radiant start of the day. My uncle moved with it in a state of mental ecstasy. At 12 o'clock exactly, when the sun had attained its highest altitude for the day, the shadow fell upon the edge of the central pit. "Here it is!" gasped the professor in an agony of joy. "Here it is! We have found it! Forward, my friends, into the interior of the earth." I looked curiously at Hans to see what reply he would make to this terrific announcement. "Fortut," said the guide tranquilly. "Forward it is," answered my uncle, who was now in the 7th heaven of delight. When we were quite ready, our watches indicated 13 minutes past 1. Chapter 14. The real journey commences. Our real journey had now commenced. Hitherto, our courage and determination had overcome all difficulties. We were fatigued at times, and that was all. Now we were about to encounter unknown and fearful dangers. I had not as yet ventured to take a glimpse down the horrible abyss into which, in a few minutes before I was about to plunge, the fateful moment had, however, at last arrived. I had still the option of refusing or accepting a share in this foolish and audacious enterprise, but I was ashamed to show more fear than the eider duck hunter. Hans seemed to accept the difficulties of the journey so tranquilly, with such calm indifference, with such perfect recklessness of all danger, that I actually blushed to appear less of a man than he. Had I been alone with my uncle, I should certainly have sat down and argued the point fully. But in the presence of the guide, I held my tongue. I gave one moment to the thought of my charming cousin, and then I advanced to the mouth of the central shaft. It measured about 100 feet in diameter, which made about 300 feet in circumference. I leaned over a rock which stood on its edge and looked down. My hair stood on end. My teeth chattered. My limbs trembled. I seemed utterly to lose my center of gravity. While my head was in a sort of whirl, like that of a drunken man, there was nothing more powerful than this attraction toward an abyss. I was about to fall headlong into the gaping well when I was drawn back from a firm and powerful hand. It was that of Hans. I had not taken lessons enough at the Felsers Kirk of Copenhagen in the art of looking down from lofty eminences without blinking. However, few as the minutes were during which I gazed down this tremendous and even wondrous shaft, I had sufficient glimpse of it to give me some idea of its physical conformation. Its sides, which were almost as perpendicular as those of a well, presented numerous projections which doubtless would assist our descent. It was a sort of wild and savage staircase, without banister or fence. A rope fastened above, near the surface, would certainly support our weight and enable us to reach the bottom. But how, when we had arrived at its utmost depth, were we to loosen it above? This was, I thought, a question of some importance. My uncle, however, was one of those men who are nearly always prepared with expedients. He hit upon a very simple method of obviating this difficulty. He unrolled a cord about as thick as my thumb, and at least 400 or 500 feet in length. He allowed about half of it to go down the pit and catch on a hitch over a great block of lava, which stood on the edge of the precipice. This done, he threw the second half after the first. Each of us could now descend by catching two cords in one hand. When about 200 feet below, all the explorer had to do was to let go one end and pull away at the other, when the cord would come falling at his feet in order to go down farther. All that was necessary was to continue the same operation. This was very excellent proposition, and no doubt a correct one. Going down appeared to me easy enough. It was the coming up again that now occupied my thoughts. Now, said my uncle, as soon as he had completed this important preparation, let us see about the baggage. It must be divided into 3 separate parcels, and each of us must carry one on his back. I allude to the more important and fragile articles. My worthy and ingenious uncle did not appear to consider that we came under the denomination. Hans, he continued, you will take charge of the tools and some of the provisions. You, Harry, must take possession of another third of the provisions and of the arms. I will load myself with the rest of the eatables and with the more delicate instruments. But, I exclaimed, our clothes, this mass of cord and ladders, who will undertake to carry them down? They will go down of themselves. And how so? I asked. You shall see. My uncle was not fond of half measures, nor did he like anything in the way of hesitation. Giving his orders to Hans, he had the whole of the non-fragile articles made up into one bundle, and the packet, firmly and solidly fastened, was simply pitched over the edge of the gulf. I heard the moaning of the suddenly displaced air and the noise of falling stones. My uncle, leaning over the abyss, followed the descent of his luggage with a perfectly self-satisfied air, and did not rise until it completely disappeared from sight. Now then, he cried, it is our turn. I put it in good faith to any man of common sense, was it possible to hear this energetic cry without a shudder? The professor fastened his case of instruments on his back. Hans took charge of the tools, and I of the arms. The descent then commenced in the following order. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I went last. Our progress was made in profound silence, a silence only troubled by the fall of pieces of rock, which, breaking from the jagged sides, fell with a roar into the depths below. I allowed myself to slide, so to speak, holding frantically on the double cord with one hand, and with the other keeping myself off the rocks by the assistance of my iron-shod pole. One idea was all the time impressed upon my brain. I feared that the upper support would fail me. The cord appeared to me far too fragile to bear the weight of 3 such persons as we were. With our luggage, I made as little use of it as possible, trusting to my own agility, and doing miracles in the way of feats of dexterity and strength upon the projecting shelves and spurs of lava, with my feet, which my feet seemed to clutch as strongly as my hands. The guide went first. I have to say that when one of the slippery and frail supports broke from under his feet, he had recourse to his usual monosyllabic way of speaking. Gif acht! Attention, look out, repeated my uncle. In about half an hour, we reached a kind of small terrace formed by a fragment of rock projecting some distance from the sides of the shaft. Hans now began to haul upon the cord on one side only, the other going as quietly upward as the other came down. It fell at last, bringing it with it a shower of small stones, lava, and dust, a disagreeable kind of rain or hail. While we were seated on this extraordinary bench, I ventured one more to look downwards. With a sigh, I discovered that the bottom was still wholly invisible. Were we, then, going direct to the interior of the earth? The performance with the cord recommenced, and a quarter of an hour later we had reached to the depth of about 200 feet. I have very strong doubts if the most determined geologist would, during that descent, have studied the nature of the different layers of earth around him. I did not trouble my head much about the matter. Whether we were among the combustible carbon, Silurians, or primitive soil, I never knew nor cared to know. Not so the inveterate professor. He must have taken notes all the way down, for at one of our halts he began a brief lecture. The farther we advance, he said, the greater is my confidence in the result. The disposition of these volcanic strata absolutely confirms the theory of Sir Humphrey Davy. We are still within the region of primordial soil, the soil in which took place the chemical operation of metals, becoming inflamed by coming in contact with the air and water. I at once regret the old and now forever exploded theory of a central fire. At all events, we shall know the truth. Such was the everlasting conclusion to which he came. I, however, was far from being in humor to discuss the matter. I had something else to think of. My silence was taken for constant, and still we continued to go down. At the expiration of 3 hours, we were, to all appearance, as far off as ever from the bottom of the well. When I looked upwards, however, I could see the upper orifice was every minute decreasing in size. The sides of the shaft were getting closer and closer together. We were approaching the regions of eternal night. And still we continued to descend. At length I noticed that when pieces of stone were detached from the sides of this stupendous precipice, they were swallowed up with less noise than before. The final sound was sooner heard. We were approaching the bottom of the abyss. As I had been very careful to keep account of all the changes of chord which took place, I was able to tell exactly what was the depth we had reached, as well as the time it had taken. We had shifted the rope 28 times, each operation taking a quarter of an hour, which in all made 7 hours. To this had to be added 28 pauses, in all 10 hours and a half. We started at once. It was now, therefore, about 11 o'clock at night. It does not require great knowledge of arithmetic to know that 28 times 200 feet make 5,600 feet in all, more than an English mile. While I was making this mental calculation, a voice broke the silence. It was the voice of Hans. "Halt!" he cried. I checked myself very suddenly, just at the moment when I was about to kick my uncle in the head. "We have reached the end of our journey," said the worthy professor in a satisfied tone. "What, the interior of the earth?" said I, slipping down to his side. "No, you stupid fellow, but we have reached the bottom of the well." "And I suppose there is no further progress to be made," I hopefully exclaimed. "Oh, yes, I can dimly see a sort of tunnel, which turns off obliquely to the right. At all events, we must see about that tomorrow. Let us sup now, and seek slumber as best we may." I thought it time, but made no observations on the point. I was fairly launched on a desperate course, and all I had to do was to go forward hopefully and trustingly. It was not even now quite dark, the light filtering down in a most extraordinary manner. We opened the provision bag, ate a frugal supper, and each did his best to find a bed amid the pile of stones, dirt, and lava which had accumulated for ages at the bottom of the shaft. I happened to grope out a pile of ropes, ladders, and clothes which we had thrown down, and upon them I stretched myself. After such a day's labor, my rough bed seemed as soft as down. For a while I lay in a sort of pleasant trance. Presently, after lying quietly for some minutes, I opened my eyes and looked upwards. As I did so, I made out a brilliant little dot at the extremity of this long, gigantic telescope. It was a star without scintillating rays. According to my calculation, it must be Beta in the constellation of the Little Bear. After this little bit of astronomical recreation, I dropped into a sound sleep.
Woo!
There we go.
Finally making a little progress.
Yeah, they're in there. The bottom of a
That's
telescope.
right.
I kept, as I was reading, I kept thinking, especially at the entrance, all I could hardly think of was Carlsbad Caverns. Kept popping into my head, that big opening there. Except this was the opening is probably a similar size actually, but the tunnel goes deeper. Sounds like to
Yeah.
me. So
Yeah.